No, I mean, I think it's a real risk with the industry if the writers are genuinely worried about it and kind of thinking about it. We're already seeing kind of applications, right, of Gen AI being used for, let's say, marketing copy, whether it's Jasper or other companies. So it's not too much of a stretch to think of, uh, original series and different kind of documentation being developed from past series. I think the kind of worry in the field is what is original then. If a lot of this technology is based off of, historical screenplays and so forth, and you're trying to create a net new series, what is the more or less kind of what's unique, what can be trademarked, etc., and what won't lead you into legal trouble. Like we saw that already with like Ed Sheeran and kind of the lawsuit that he's facing, and several others around kind of the originality of, let's say, music or media in general.
Hello, I'm your host, Mike Gelb, and this is the Consumer VC podcast where we discuss the intersection of venture capital and consumer innovation. If you're enjoying the show, also subscribe to my newsletter at theconsumervc.com, where you'll receive new episodes straight to your inbox and a weekly recap of all the consumer deals that are happening. All content and episodes are for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not investment advice. Thank you, Vincent Diallo, for the introduction to our guest today, Kevin Parakkattu, partner at Plug and Play Ventures. Plug and Play is the ultimate innovation platform that invests and connects entrepreneurs, corporations, and investors worldwide. Some of Kevin's investments include Madison Reed, Manscaped, and Nada. We discuss the founding story of Plug and Play, why they invest in consumer brands and inventory-based businesses in the first place, how he's thinking about today's market, and much, much, much more. Without further ado, here's Kevin. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me here today. How are you?
Hey, Mike, doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great, doing really great. I want to start from, I guess, the very, very beginning of your journey at Plug and Play. How did you get your start at Plug and Play?
Yeah, sure. So my path to VC, so I was in college in New York City, and I, at that time, wanted to be an investment banker. Like in New York City, every kind of student there wants to become a banker or a consultant, it seems like. And now I'm sure it's probably like product manager or something. But so like most folks, interviewed at the banks and tried to get it. And ultimately, had six or so super days lined up, which was like the final round of investment banking interviews. And then unanimously got rejected six times over from every single bank. So, a lot of people say like their path into entrepreneurship was like they had a kind of like this calling, or they saw this massive problem in the market and stuff like that. For me, it was seeing kind of zero options out of college and saying, you know what's there to lose at this point? Might as well kind of get that entrepreneurial bug. So what happened was I had two friends. We just complained constantly about how expensive it was to get college clothing, at a college bookstore or kind of design your own. So we ended up creating our own, essentially online design tool that allowed students to design their own custom clothing, worked with different community organizations, etc. The business was completely inventoryless. We basically worked with screen printers all around the country, offered 2-day shipping based on wherever you printed out of, and more or less allowed and created our own online design tool so that students could design their own. So that business did well because there's only three of us, and we actually never needed to raise venture funding. But that got me the kind of tech bug. So then after that, one of the VCs that we were talking to when we were even thinking about financing just had an analyst position open up, and they were a firm in Connecticut. So ended up joining them, stayed for about a year where we did a kind of variety of deals. So we did like a luxury pet retail business. We did a painkiller business and several others. So it wasn't kind of traditional venture capital. It was more kind of investing in early stage businesses of all shapes and forms. One of the partners there ended up leaving and joining Simon Property Group's, at that time, new venture fund called Simon Ventures. And he texted me one day and said, "Hey, there's this new firm I'm working with called Plug and Play. Simon and Plug and Play just partnered up. You should come and join them." So I joined. I was one of the kind of the first five on the ventures team or investment team, and then we've now scaled, that team alone to about 150 people. The company went from 50 people when I joined to now almost 700 in the past 6 years. So it's kind of an insane time to join, and yeah, and then first did fintech and retail as kind of the practices that I was focused on. With kind of a background in commerce and consumer, ended up more focusing on that, and then rise into the ranks and more recently moving to Austin.
That's wow. That's crazy. That's awesome being part of Plug and Play, like in its when it was much smaller. Because when I think of Plug and Play, I think of. I mean, I remember telling you this, but like I've seen people just repping like Plug and Play in like airports when I travel and stuff like that. Like it's quite like a pretty well known brand when it comes to on the investment side. Can you give us just a little bit of background in terms of though what kind of Plug and Play is, all the different I guess different ways it operates, and a little bit about like the founding story of it?
So plug and play is a pretty unique story, and kind of depends on who you talk to in Silicon Valley, because they may remember plug and play from kind of almost like a different era. So plug and play really starts mid '90s. Our CEO and founder ends up making his money in other kind of classic businesses. So he had like a water bottling business, a kind of a plastic polymer business, etc. And like most folks, he ends up buying real estate. He just ends up buying real estate in a really great area, University Avenue in Palo Alto, which, as you know, is right next to Stanford. So at some point, he owns about 10% of the street. And he has kind of several different, stores and commercial kind of opportunities there. And one of them he decides to create as a co-working space. So he ends up renting that office space out to a bunch of different startups, and then opportunistically investing in them. So those startups end up becoming behemoths of today: Google, Logitech, PayPal, and several others, kind of through that endeavor. So he gets the entrepreneurial bug, or kind of the VC investing bug, early. He's kind of a classic real estate guy, though. So he decides to get a much larger space in Sunnyvale, 150,000 square foot facility, former kind of Philips offices that we reconvert into a co-working facility. And then, 10 years or so go by, and then we start noticing kind of different corporations coming into our doors, just asking about, hey, so who are some of the startups in here? Who can we work with? And that was when our light bulb moment went off, where we had originally just invested in startups opportunistically in the building and not really had provided any kind of corporate add-on. It was, hey, we have a data center, we have different services we can offer you. And when the corporates came in, we realized that we can actually create a model whereby, we can create a panel of corporations around certain verticals and introduce them to startups. Basically what we call kind of a many to many. So many corporations talking to many startups in kind of an organized fashion. And then we, as investors, can more or less monitor that and hopefully invest in the best companies. So that was a genesis of the model. I mean, we first started actually with commerce and retail, where we partnered with Kohl's and several other kind of companies. And that was actually in that initial cohort. We had Honey and Rappi and all these other crazy companies that we ended up becoming investors in. And then we scaled out into 17 other verticals. So the model is today is corporations pay us to have access to amazing startups that can hopefully solve some of their key challenges. The startups do not give us any equity, and we don't charge them any fee for what we offer. And if it works well, it's a win-win-win, meaning the corporations get access to amazing startups that can hopefully solve some of their challenges. We as investors get access to startups that we can engage with our corporate audience and see which ones are gaining traction. And the startups get free business development. And in the last 3 years, we even accelerated that model even more by now raising funds, where our corporations are now also oftentimes LPs in our separate funds, which allows us to invest even more than we typically did.
So the corporations were originally, is this roughly right? They were kind of paying you a fee just to honestly manage and bring opportunities to them, but you weren't, well, you, I guess you were also writing checks in those funds, but was that money coming from other places before the corporations actually became your LPs?
Yeah. So initially, I mean, it was essentially the family office of the Amides, the founders of Plug and Play, where we were just opportunistically investing in the businesses, right? Over time, the business model of Plug and Play has now fed into the original investment vehicle, whereby the revenue coming in more or less, after covering operating expenses, the profit is then reinvested into the startups that we're introducing to these corporations. But we don't always invest in every company, right? It's kind of building a relationship with the startup and opportunistically doing it. And then now we've been able to supercharge that where the corporates, are LPs, and now we're able to invest even greater amounts.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Also quite as you say, like it's pretty unique in terms of you're creating this community or really essentially like a market in order for the actual startups themselves for business development opportunities can talk to corporations. When it comes to thinking about what opportunities and pain points that some of these corporations are experiencing, do you and then looking at okay, what then startups are kind of solving these problems? How does it also work? Is it are these corporations kind of telling you some of their pain points and problems that they're solving, and then you all think, okay, then we need to focus maybe on this certain area. Who are the best entrepreneurs building in maybe this specific vertical or solving this pain point? Or is it a bit more like looking just not really having that input from corporations, but looking more so just about talking to entrepreneurs and a bit more maybe bottoms up per se?
Yeah, no, it's honestly a little bit of both, right? So we, in some sense, are the therapist of corporations. They come to us with their problems. In theory, we're patient, we're listening, we understand, and then we're able to more or less kind of, help them find a solution with different entrepreneurs. And maybe that's not exactly what that company is doing, but maybe it could potentially solve what they're doing, right? So corporations come to us with real-time problems oftentimes, like, hey, we're facing, let's say in the case of retail, we're facing stockouts in Asia, or we're looking to better understand our consumer or whatever it may be. And then we're more or less finding startups that can hopefully solve some of those challenges. And then we either organize them into kind of two different formats. So one is in our different cohorts. So we run cohorts of startups that we accelerate twice a year. They're all the way from seed stage to pre-IPO, and that's kind of that's a that's a consensus based model, meaning all of our corporations are letting us know, hey, here's kind of our 6 months priorities. Do you have startups in and around this space? So therefore, the startups is a reflection of a group of different companies. So Nike may face certain challenges that McDonald's may not face, and McDonald's may face certain challenges, et cetera. But by creating that cohort model, you really kind of get that discovery element of, oh, wait, I didn't even think about that. Maybe that could be applicable for my industry. So that's one part. So they're telling us about their current problems. But I think what we are trying to do is saying, what are the solutions of today and what new problems have they created that will, in theory, need a new solution? So an example would be, let's say robotic automation in the factory setting, where, all these different, robots are handling kind of every single process from picking to actually shipping the product. What kind of new problems does that create? Well, the routine maintenance of those robots, the programming of them, the kind of new learning or data models that they now have to go under. Those are all new things that maybe these corporations will face later. And that's where we kick in and try to think of those new problems that come about based on the consensus of where we think the industries are going. And then that's generally what we like to invest in. And then maybe they might be more applicable to our corporate base in a year or two later when they're facing those problems.
I like that in that it's a bit of both, where corporations come to you with what their problem solving their problems or what they potentially might be interested that really could help their organizations on their side, potential bottlenecks that they're running into, and then you all are able to kind of source companies that can help those corporations that are trying to solve that particular problem, but at the same time might also be open to maybe other problems that might not have been thought about yet on the corporate side. And then it's like it's two cohorts. Is that right? Annually?
Yeah, so it's two cohorts per vertical per location. So we have about 50 or so locations. So about 2,000 or so companies are going through one of our cohorts every year, all over the globe.
To know that you're based in Austin, I mean, How do you think about like Austin's like are you, since you're based and focus on the cohorts in Austin, does a company have to be based or have like a tie into Austin in order for them to be part of that cohort?
Yeah, so just quick clarification. So I live in Austin, but I mainly manage our kind of Silicon Valley office. Um, yeah, we don't have a formal presence in Texas as of now. I lived in California for the last 5 years and then moved to Austin about 2 years ago. But in terms of kind of our processes or how we look at Texas, I mean, Texas is going to be our next market. We're super excited about it. There's kind of 54 Fortune 500 companies. There's a variety of different entrepreneurs that kind of live in the state. We've looked at kind of, LinkedIn statistics, et cetera, and it seems like a lot of UT Austin graduates and a lot of Baylor graduates and other kind of leading Texas institutions, there's kind of a brain drain going on where they're often going to the coast to work at different startups and so forth. So we see this state as a next market. So that was part of the reason why I moved. And then hopefully kind of in the next 12 to 18 months, launching something here. Perhaps in consumer, we're kind of seeing where the industry goes.
Got it. Well, how are you thinking about like the industry right now, especially when it comes to, media and commerce and and the overall landscape today? Since it is like I mean, it seems like it's a pretty odd, weird market right now.
Yes, and on the backdrops of HBO rebranding to Max again. The third rebrand, right? I'm trying to think of how many different times HBO has gone different ways. Two different worlds, right? So commerce is near and dear to our heart. Let's take kind of the fashion retail space as an example. What we're seeing specifically in that space is kind of over inventory. Essentially, what happened there, and you play in the supply chain space, so you know it well, is where a lot of these retailers and brands faced stock shortages, et cetera, and had to order. Then faced a variety of different issues alongside the supply chain, and then now we're sitting on kind of copious amounts of inventory. And now we're seeing kind of mass liquidations, players looking for any kind of wholesale outlet or any potential where they can, get rid of that dead inventory. So that seems to be a kind of a consistent challenge that we're seeing kind of amongst our retailers and brands. Um, Couple that with kind of cost cutting, lower consumer confidence, kind of a general reluctancy with inflationary kind of pressures. Overall, I think that's affecting retail in kind of a pause moment where we're seeing that from an innovation perspective. The interests are changing for closer to automation. How can we potentially be more efficient as an organization? All of that. On the media side, I think the writer strike is so interesting in kind of what's going on in that lens. So like one thing that I noted kind of in the recent kind of negotiation is on the side of the writers, it's hey, you can't use any kind of generative AI or any kind of AI and replace our jobs in the future, and there should be some kind of assurance against using that technology. We're seeing that as well, where the entire media landscape as we go more into OTT and streaming has really changed in the effect on labor, whereby media companies, historically, if you had a kind of a on television show, you were running for several seasons, and then you were getting paid royalties and so forth. I mean, I think it's like well known at this point. The cast of Friends is still, generating millions off of the revenue of their shows. But then when you do kind of from a streaming perspective, oftentimes these shows are single series, limited episodes. Filming is for kind of a short period, and royalties aren't exactly the thing, or they have kind of a different lens as to how they're structured. So therefore, the writers are in one sense treated differently and more commoditized, even though we kind of live in a limelight of all things media. So that's it's we're seeing kind of a focus on an interest in using artificial intelligence and using kind of different solutions to optimize the cost structure, primarily from both groups. I think it's just given kind of macro conditions.
So, on the AI side, do you see that AI might replace when it comes to maybe some of the writers, not obviously all writers when it comes to a TV show, but maybe some of like the writers' jobs that actually maybe like a head writer per se might. communicate and write a script with AI as opposed to hiring other writers for a particular series?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a real risk with the industry if the writers are genuinely worried about it and kind of thinking about it. We're already seeing kind of applications, right, of Gen AI being used for, let's say, marketing copy, whether it's Jasper or other companies. So it's not too much of a stretch to think of, uh, original series and different kind of documentation being developed from past series. I think the kind of worry in the field is what is original then. If a lot of this technology is based off of, historical screenplays and so forth, and you're trying to create a net new series, what is the more or less kind of what's unique, what can be trademarked, etc., and what won't lead you into legal trouble. Like we saw that already with like Ed Sheeran and kind of the lawsuit that he's facing, and several others around kind of the originality of, let's say, music or media in general.
No, that's a good point, and it seems as well when it comes to TV shows and film content in the sense as opposed to music content. Well, also music content has gone hammered too. But as you say, it seems like writers might be get double. It's kind of like a double whammy for them, where you might get instead you might be utilizing generative AI, so it might lead to less jobs available. But even also, if you get a job, as you say, we've now shifted to streaming. Not totally, but with streaming and the royalties far lower, or I don't know what the royalty kind of looks like on streaming versus linear television. But and then also with limited series, that your royalties and what you're actually getting paid if you do have a hit show, that's going to be far less than what it used to be.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're seeing like it's the economics just don't make sense necessarily when you think about what the studio could pay for the individual, let's say, writer or staff, compared to, let's say, the studio could have paid for Friends, right? So on Friends, you would have that advertising revenue, you'd have that kind of hosting by Comcast and NBC that would consistently be able to pay everyone's salaries. But then when you look at kind of a Netflix user, it's, let's say, the average subscription is $10 a month, and the studio is paying hundreds of $1 millions for that production. The revenue enters the cost structure, it just doesn't work out, right? So there has to be cost optimization at some point. And it's very clear that today's kind of strike is more or less evident of that cost structure affecting the average person.
As an investor and obviously someone that's very very deep into investing in media, where then are you thinking about what actual opportunities in this landscape actually could be interesting to you?
Yeah. So I think the space it's been around, it's kind of dormant, but doesn't necessarily get a lot of love is rights management, which is just a space that is historically done by kind of third party firms of looking at kind of what the media rights are. Sometimes you hear of different rights that have sold their different kind of media rights with that. I think that's going to be ever the more prevalent, right? I mean, we already saw that with the Drake song that came out that was completely generated by generative AI, and several others where we're seeing potential applications where the whole question of trademark and infringing that comes on. So how do you kind of detect copyright or any kind of issues with that? How do studios more or less think about evolving that technology with it? And then how could you potentially leverage this technology in your, let's say, music creation or so forth, rather than prohibiting it outright? Because I don't think that's how technology advances. You don't just prohibit something; you have to create new laws and regulations or rules around it to do that. So I think that's pretty interesting. I think kind of on the intersection of media and commerce is the ever-ending fight to lower consumer acquisition costs. I mean, like CAC is a new rent, right? It is a thing that's kind of often said. You saw companies like Leap Retail and several others kind of base themselves on that premise that if you have a brick and mortar presence, you will naturally have higher quality traffic than a web browser, etc. So that's always been interesting to us in how to better monetize your ad traffic, and or create a better kind of optimization funnel through that. And there have been kind of a number of technologies that have gone through that space, right? So I think that will stay relevant. And then more on the commerce end, specifically for direct-to-consumer brands, is working capital, right? We're seeing that consistently, brands struggling with that. Some of our earlier investments, those companies had to more or less give out a huge cash outlay in Q1 to pay for different inventory, and then we'll get paid back in Q4. The cash cycle was very inefficient, and oftentimes, in the heyday of D2C venture capital investing, these companies would often raise venture capital money to pay for that working capital needs. And then you can, that worked for a short period of time, and then we saw kind of the downfall of that with a variety of D2C S1s. So like a huge kind of gamut of different interests right now.
Why does Plug and Play invest in brands? Period. Because if part of the proposition or value add, right, is that kind of on the BD side to corporations, and for corporations to figure out, okay, what types of companies could actually help us with optimizing maybe some of the problems we're running in. Obviously brands are selling to consumers, they aren't selling to corporates. Why invest in brands in the first place?
Yeah, no, I mean, if I leave with an impact at Plug and Play, it's kind of with this is uh, is convincing other folks to invest in direct to consumer brands when there was largely kind of a hesitancy to do it. I think it was primarily because when you're talking to corporations all day long and different spaces and so forth, you naturally can see the white spaces that exist that no one's really tackling, right? Like, so let's take Manscaped as an example. So Manscaped, obviously super edgy category, below the waist grooming, really kind of a taboo subject, even when they launched in 2016. And then, at the time, we're working with some of the companies that create kind of the leading razors and so forth. The interest there is primarily in different things. So we can see from that the change in marketing, the focus on kind of an edgier language, the huge focus on kind of high quality, more higher priced products, selling entirely D2C. And that's where when you see kind of the white space and the opportunity, and it's just kind of taking on those investments. Our primary investment thesis is always going to be kind of B2B technology, but opportunistically, kind of we see these opportunities come up, and then it's a no brainer for us.
On the D2C consumer brands front, how do you also think about this as well from like an exit potential standpoint too, in terms of okay, there's white space here. I believe that like a corporation will eventually, because most of like the successful exits happen for strategic. I presume there's probably gonna be more appetite for it in terms of what the successes are, just because of the kind of the state of how brands have exited to from an IPO in the past typically hasn't really panned out. So there probably will be more appetite to want to when it comes to an exit, that exit actually comes from a strategic than from going into the public markets. But how do you think about it when you make an investment in on the brand side from if from an exit opportunity perspective?
It's a totally kind of different mindset, right? Like, I think what we saw in a couple of years ago, where direct to consumer brands were being valued like SaaS companies, where let's say a company was doing 10 million in revenue, they were being valued at 100 million because of, let's say, a celebrity sponsorship or a lot of hype around the product and so forth. And now we're starting to see, several brands getting kind of more realistic multiples, primarily because of all the challenges that we've discussed, right? Inventory, cash orders, consumers buying. You don't always need, let's say, a baggage item or a new mattress or whatever it may be every 2 months, where you'd have kind of a frequent purchasing order. So for us, as we kind of evaluate these companies, so it's entirely different on the SaaS and kind of enterprise technology side. It's really kind of on the ability for partially of us to be able to create value for the company. If we know every single insurance company in the world, then in theory, if we invest in a insurtech company, how many companies can we provide value to them? And let's say get to their next milestone, whatever that may be, a million in ARR, or whatever it may be. On the consumer inventory, kind of direct to consumer side, it's really evaluating just the core multiples. First, of course, it's focusing on the team and understanding if the team can make sense there. Then it's the product, and if we think the product has a lot of viability, and has kind of a wide application. But we typically do not invest in kind of a pre-revenue consumer brand. I think others are really equipped to do that, and you've had several kind of great investors on your pod, just talking about all the ways that they're able to do it. For us, it's how can we give them access to potentially the storefront? How can we give them access to potential agencies or others that we can that can help them along the way? But and then when we do invest, it's not anywhere near SaaS multiples. It's kind of almost like a hard and fast no if a company is raising anywhere near that, because we've seen even through our own portfolio, right, of companies that where we maybe learning this, we tried to invest in those companies and then saw kind of the rise and fall of them from a multiples and valuation perspective.
Roughly from a multiples perspective, what's typically like the range that you would, if you like a company that you would maybe make the investment compared to what like the SaaS multiple would be?
Yeah, so from a classic inventory business, like we're generally looking at, let's say, 1.5 to 3x top line. And then on the SaaS side, that really varies. It kind of more or less depends on the speed at which they can kind of acquire their TAM, what we think they can actually, reasonably gain in market share. But oftentimes, I think the kind of the standard in Silicon Valley these days is if it's a pre-revenue business, it's usually north of, let's say, 10 million post for a classic, let's say, SaaS business. Obviously, there's variations to this, but and even on that front, I think we are becoming more valuation sensitive as we're seeing kind of with all VCs, where there's historical dry powder. Everyone is sitting on these kind of large amounts of capital that's not being invested, and at the same time, founders are often raising at sky high valuations that get corrected through lack of interest. So it's kind of checking ourselves too and making sure not that we're in a hype cycle or so forth that we've all seen now in the last 3 years.
I really appreciate that. And to understand a little bit more about the process, is it typically you you obviously are looking at companies all the time. You select a few of them to participate in the cohort, and then depending on how that company does, or with the cohort, and maybe feedback that you get from corporates or what have you, then you might make the investment or not make the investment. Or are there other kind of ways that you think about on the diligence side?
Yeah, so we can invest whenever. Yeah, so I think we often invest when companies are going through a cohort, but we've invested before, we've invested after. Our big thing is that we're not setting accelerator terms. Let's say 120K for 7% or whatever the cookie cutter model is, because not everyone fits in that bucket. And for us, what we've seen consistently is that corporations vary as to the type of technologies they want to see. Some want to be on the ground floor and work with two founders and iterating that idea. Others want a very established kind of product that they work with. So for us as investors, using that intel as kind of a backdrop to our investments, we too have to be flexible in when and how we invest, right? In terms of our process, the feedback helps, but through time, it's largely been kind of the knowledge that we've gathered, right? So, with 17 different verticals and working with most of the Fortune 500 at this point, we've been able to create kind of a huge database of notes and so forth that we can rely on, and then a pretty successful founder network that we can now consult and say, hey, what do you think about this new technology that's doing X, Y, Z? So the corporate base has been helpful, but now we've been able to leverage kind of all the different aspects of the platform has created. It went from, let's say, a marketplace of corporations and startups to now a platform that has government, has successful startup founders, mentors, corporations, universities, etc. All of different kind of networks that we tap into when going into diligence.
That's interesting because as you pointed out earlier, like you're stage agnostic when it comes to the cohorts. It seems like it could be, I think you said like a seed company all the way to like pre-IPO, right? That can actually participate in the cohort. So that's pretty, because as you say, like there's a variety of problems that a corporation has, and so and there's obviously, as you say, it's like not like a cookie cutter, like a variety of other kind of like accelerators per se, in that capacity. What's one book that's inspired you personally and one book that's inspired you professionally?
Oh, interesting. I think the classic for me on the both kind of personal and professional side, is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. The classic. I'm sure other people have quoted that before. I mean, I think when I think about growing up, I didn't learn English until I was 6 years old. By nature, I grew up in the U.S., but my parents decided to speak our native language at home. So learning kind of the aspects of working through the business world and so forth, and building genuine relationships, such a good book. For me, it really helped in kind of actionable things. Like one thing I like to do is take notes on people, like things that they've shared over time. And kind of, I have a doc that, so and so has a birthday coming up or has two kids or whatever it may be. And that was one of the tips that the book has taught in terms of just being focused on that. Another good one is Never Eat Alone by Keith Ferrazzi.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yes. Similar concept, right? Like of how building genuine relationships and so forth. Like I'm sure you deployed a lot of similar techniques when you were launching your podcast. So both of those have been super helpful. On the personal side, I think the book called Shoe Dog, the classic kind of interview of Phil Knight, and his rise into creating Nike, that is just incredibly inspiring for me. I read that book probably once a year just to think about how Phil went from wanting to become a Japanese shoe importer to now creating kind of one of the most valuable brands in history. All it seems like to some extent by serendipity and accident, but then also obviously a lot of strategy and focus. Just a good book and something I always recommend to colleagues.
Yeah, and I feel like there's like quite a few moments where you don't think he's gonna make it, and then you realize that as you during the book, you have to like kick yourself and be like, "Wait, this is Nike. Like, of course you're gonna make it." It's kind of crazy. And yeah, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and also Never Eat Alone. Those are two of my favorites. I actually loved like one of my favorite moments in Never Eat Alone was when Keith is talking about being in the cab in the morning and just calling everybody on their birthday and like and saying like the cab drivers, I'm sure like all think that I'm totally insane, but I leave like all the like voicemails and like mapping out like when's like the appropriate time to call and stuff. So crazy, but like such a great book. I also like recommend that to so many people. And I mean, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Yeah, I adore that book. It's so good. So good.
Yeah. I'm actually reading another one. It's called Unscaled by Hemant Taneja from General Catalyst. Um, Really interesting book. He's basically studying how scale was the primary differentiator in technology companies until fairly recently. And now there's a huge focus on decoupling, on not having any kind of large capital expenditure, et cetera. So like, for example, if you were, let's say a company that operated a diagnostic software, you would need, in theory, kind of large amounts of storage to store all the kind of consumer data. But now, kind of the new companies that are coming about are much more cloud focused, much more nimble. They're not obviously having that, and there's been a huge change in how the industry evaluates assets. And it used to be kind of the main thing that drove valuations, and now it's the opposite, where it's seen as why do you have that huge cost structure, et cetera. And I wonder if that's going to change now. Like I wonder if that tide's going to come back somewhat to having some sort of scale and some sort of ownership, as we're seeing kind of different assets, cloudified, if you will.
No, totally. That's a great point. I mean, even thinking about it from a consumer brand standpoint, I think many investors like I talk with a CPG investor, and she was saying how, when brands vertically integrate and actually own their operations, that could scare off a number of investors because it's like, why do that? But actually, long term, obviously it depends on the business, depends if it makes sense. Every situation is different, but long term, if you actually own your manufacturing, you have a lot more control in terms of maybe your margin. You don't have to maybe negotiate costs, but you do have a lot of upfront capex as well, that you obviously have to deploy. And so it's quite interesting, kind of rethinking when does it make sense to like vertically integrate your brand, or if it makes sense to open up your own factory, or if it makes sense to actually, co-manufacture, which, so many more brands obviously co-manufacture than obviously producer than actually are vertically integrated. But like on that standpoint too, that's also quite interesting.
Yeah. Like, I mean, at some end, right? Like, so you have like let's say within commerce, right? You have like the Shopify model, which is the hub and spoke. Like Shopify, hey, we're the commerce platform, but if you want to plug in a return solution or whatever it may be, here's kind of this marketplace of third party apps. And then now there's kind of the anti Shopify, the cart.com of the world, which is, hey, we will create everything in house and provide you an all in one solution to that, right? And then like it's kind of this ongoing war of, well, do we want scale or not scale? And then when both of those companies, I'm sure, are raising, it's a different pitch of, hey, we're going to need, let's say, $5 million to run this company, whereas hey, we're going to need 100 million off the bat to develop the kind of whole suite of tools. And then venture investors sit always like, on kind of both ends of that tail.
Well, where do you consider yourself? Because obviously, if you have a whole suite of like, I hear investors a lot say, obviously, and also founders too, you have to focus on one thing, focus on, the one problem, maybe the one pain point or problem that you're solving. Where, in the cart.com example, it's a suite of solutions, right? You're trying to solve many problems for the entrepreneur. Where do you sit when you actually get pitches from entrepreneurs if they're trying to maybe solve or offer like a suite of products versus maybe just one thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think like even let's say in cart.com, right? Like they are developing kind of a suite of different features, more or less on the premise of hey, we want to provide this all-in-one solution because we think Shopify commerce or so forth is broken, um, which is interesting. I mean, we're not investors in that company. I just found it as an interesting kind of tidbit um, on as to how we evaluate companies is more or less like what is your singular mission that you are entirely focused on, and is that mission something achievable, and how are you going to create the products and features that get there. Oftentimes what we're seeing, and we generally agree with kind of the mass market advice, which is like if you develop a product without any feedback or customer demand, you're just developing, you're tinkering and so forth. And there are times where you're kind of in a Steve Jobs-esque moment where you're creating technology that the consumer didn't know they wanted, or the customer and so forth didn't know what they wanted. But a lot of times it's not on enterprise technology. They have a clear mandate, they have a clear interest, they've cost evaluated kind of every different structure, and they've chosen to buy versus build or so forth. So in specific kind of in the market that we often play in, it's often very advantageous to find that product feature that's large enough, that solves a clear problem. And then money has to talk, the traction has to come and so forth. Otherwise it's just not viable. Like it's, especially in this kind of venture climate, you just like the ability to tinker and create kind of a whole suite and just throw it at a wall without necessarily a vision behind it or kind of a clear as to why, it just isn't flying in today's venture market.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Kevin, this has been such a blast. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike. This is great. Loved it.
And there you have it. It was a pleasure chatting with Kevin. Thanks so much for listening, folks. If you're enjoying Consumer VC, subscribe to the newsletter so you can get all the new episodes straight to your inbox and a weekly recap of all the consumer deals that are happening at theconsumervc.com. Thanks.